Hello, my name is Keisha Preston, and this is my final project for assessment and evaluation of students with mild to moderate disabilities class, supporting the assessment for Manuel plan. So here's the purpose of this. The purpose of this is to explain in detail the evaluation process of 13-year-old student Manuel. Explain how evaluation data lays the foundation for instructional planning and present recommended next steps for Manuel based on the findings. So, Manuel is a 13-year-old student. He resides with his mother, father, and is the youngest of three children. His primary language is English. However, Spanish is also frequently spoken in his home. He was referred for evaluation by his teacher. Through observations, the teacher noticed that Manuel struggles with all reading and writing assignments across his classes, and in-class interventions have not been effective. In a small group reading, have not been effective. In small group reading, he cannot focus when completing his writing assignments. Behaviorally, Manuel presents a very eager student. As a very eager student, he also interacts well with his peers and is very outgoing. However, faced with a task that is difficult for him, he displays frustration and then shuts down, making it challenging for him to continue his work. Uh, he was required to take a break even during the evaluation process. Manuel has been determined to have an intellectual disability, dyslexia, which is a learning disability that disrupts the brain and how it processes written language, and it causes trouble with reading and skills related to reading. So, a little background first and some perspective about some legal cases that developed and set the standard for ethical standards um, that impacted assessment. So you had Diana versus the State Board of Education. That was one where a case was filed on behalf of students in California who were determined to be developmentally delayed based on an IQ test that was given. The court found that the IQ test was not culturally representative uh, for the students because it was given in English and they were Spanish speaking students. Um, that case, along with the Larry P. versus Riles case, um, which also argued that the same ethical standards, the same educational standards and IQ tests um, that were given to students of color, Black students in Washington, D.C., were not the same as that we're giving to students, white students or non-black or non-students of color in other parts of DC, which I understand as a resident of Washington, DC, depending on where you live at, does have or has can have an effect on the educational services that could possibly be received as far as resources. So those two cases actually changed the landscapes of how assessments were done, that assessments needed to be culturally relevant and appropriate to the dynamic that it was being given to. So if it was a person of a race other than white or a different speaking student, that evaluation and assessment had to be given in their native language, and it had to be culturally appropriate. And of course, the Individuals with Disability Education Act is the law, is the blueprint for which special education is facilitated, including things like providing accommodations for students, as well as least restrictive classrooms. So giving students the right, despite their developmental disability, uh, the right to free and appropriate education. So the multidisciplinary assessment. So the first part for Manuel was actually identifying Manuel's issue, which is something that Mr. Franklin did and other teachers, specifically with his reading. They identified that he did not read well fluently, um, and that because of that, he also did not write well. And additionally, he did once he could not understand something, um, he shut down in class. He wasn't willing to do any of the work. It wasn't an issue with his math class, which seemed to be a subject that he liked, but for anything that had to do with English language arts, Manuel did not do well. So there were meetings with Mr. Franklin, his general education teacher, to just determine um, what, if anything, needed to be done and should be done. And then speaking with Manuel's parents to discuss its concerns, get some information about the family dynamic. They gave information about some of his medical history, his family dynamic, but that also that even though English was his primary language, he did live in a Spanish speaking home. In my experience, that double language, that dual language, can sometimes cause um, a challenge with students actually understanding letters and words and decoding and things like that. So, because of the observations of Miguel, based on assessment scores, based on work samples and observations in class, it was recommended that he did a response to intervention plan, RTI. That is where students receive instructions on the core curriculum. That's tier one. Um, tier two, if the student is not quite grasping the work in tier one, then they are given additional instruction in small groups, um, same lesson, same objective, but in a smaller group setting with maybe students that are like-minded like them that also need supports, to see if that is helpful. And then if that is not responsive, tier three, if the student is not responsive to tier one and tier two, then they receive even more additional and individualized instruction. And that includes smaller group. They may have more work time, accommodated work, still based on the objective. But Manuel, excuse me, was moved to tier three. So the role of the special educational professional. Um, yes, Manuel was in a general ed class, but now that the interventions are happening, the special education professional's role is to one, design and implement lessons and interventions and different things with students, and also make sure that they are receiving any services down the line. They also support the general educator in understanding the details of the student's IEP, or whatever interventions or delays the student is seen to have. And then they also design and implement the IEP through plops and goals and different things like that set in the IEP, to accommodate and make sure that the student is learning and growing. Um, Leading up to the IEP, the special education professional helps with evaluations and assessments, to gauge the student's learning, what the gaps may be, what the areas for growth. As stated earlier, it was determined that Manuel had dyslexia. So, based on conducted evaluations, Manuel's strengths were reading comprehension, verbal comprehension, perceptual reading, and mathematics. However, he struggled with spelling, visual auditory learning, letter identification, phonological awareness, and rapid naming. His struggles fall right in line to what it was ultimately determined based on his specific evaluations and assessments that he is dyslexic. And letter identification and phonological awareness and spelling are areas that are affected by if someone has dyslexia. Formal assessments, just a breakdown of formal assessments that Manuel received. So in the District of Columbia, we have what is called CAPE, the Comprehensive Assessment Progress. It's a yearly test. It is the state required test that measures the proficiency in students in English and math, and for third, fifth, and eighth grade, also science. Of course, we have report cards, which is a summary of students' academic performance. It's traditionally given 4 times a year. And the fourth report card usually has a set of grades for the last quarter and the final grade. And then criterion reference tests, those are assessments that are given that evaluates mastery of a specific learning objective or standard. So like if the Common Core standard for Manuel, who would be an eighth grade student, one of the ELA Common Core standards would be he must be able to analyze a text with provide a claim and supporting details based on what he's read. And he should be able to independently identify those details. So something like that would be a criterion reference test. For informal assessments, those are usually done more frequently, like a daily exit ticket, which is given at the end of a classroom lesson. And exit tickets could be written, they could be multiple choice, they could be short answer questions, and they can also be given orally. Self-reflections. This one is just to allow students to reflect on their experiences in the classroom, and it gives the students an opportunity to write down in their own words what they have learned, and it helps the educator assess their learning level of an objective. And then the work samples, and that's just collection of work throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the month, just to see if the student is grasping the concept of the objective based on previous student work samples and different exit tickets and the formal and informal assessments that Manuel had. He did fit the criteria for the initial evaluation. So the recommendations for Manuel are: one, starting with phonological awareness and phonics-based interventions. These are very good for helping students with dyslexia specifically to learn to understand words, letters, phenoms, how word blends. I'm sorry, letter blends, word blends, everything blends together in the English language. And things with basic phonic activities that help him to understand not only how to read the letters and write the letters, but how they sound in words, how they blend together. So phonological awareness and phonics-based interventions are very helpful for a student like Manuel. Also multi-sensory structured language. So what these interventions do is it allows you to give work or give accommodated work or assessments in various ways using different senses. Instead of just vision, it could be by hearing, like auditory. It could be sensory through touch. Various ways that the student can intake the English language. So using multi-sensory structured language also allows them to hear letters, to hear word blends, to touch and feel different textures of objects and use that as a way to connect them to the word and how it should be written and how you would pronounce it. It also helps with fluency in reading. As with the phonological awareness and phonics-based interventions, they also help with fluency in reading and accuracy, which promotes accuracy in writing. And then assistive technology is things like text to speech, where a student can be asked a question and they can say what the question, to the answer, and it will take it and write it for them. Also, read alouds are also another good intervention to help students like Manuel develop his reading and writing skills. All right, so that's all we have. Also want to add that it takes a collaborative effort to come up with an IEP. It takes a team of leaders. It takes a team of people to come together and give their input. And that can range from school pathologists, speech pathologists, language, um, behavioral, different things like that. Also, the input of the gen ed teacher, as well as the input of the special education professional, all to develop a functioning individualized education program that would help Manuel grow. All right. Thank you.